1 minute ago, the European Union dropped a shocking new demand on the UK, an uncapped youth mobility deal that could allow unlimited young Europeans to live and work here. Westminster is rattled. Starmer is suddenly on the defensive, and critics say this could quietly reopen the Brexit debate all over again. Only moments ago, political shockwaves began rolling through Westminster after the European Union unexpectedly confirmed that it wants the United Kingdom to sign a brand new youth mobility agreement, one that would allow large numbers of young Europeans to enter Britain to work, study or live with no specific numerical limit attached. And yes, you heard that correctly, uncapped. Now, normally EU-UK negotiations don't cause this level of political chaos. Most agreements since Brexit have been technical, gradual and carefully worded to avoid explosive public debate. But this one, this specific wording, is a direct political earthquake. Because if you listen carefully, the phrase uncapped youth mobility is a political grenade. It immediately raises the biggest question in British politics: is freedom of movement coming back? And honestly, that question alone is enough to set off alarms across the entire political system. Within minutes of the news dropping, opposition voices jumped to microphones, journalists started firing questions, social media exploded, and suddenly everyone, from Westminster insiders to political commentators to voters at home, began asking the same thing. What exactly is happening here? To understand the seriousness of this moment, let's break down what actually changed. For weeks, the British government has been quietly rebuilding relationships with European partners. Starmer's government promised a more diplomatic, more cooperative era after years of Brexit tension. But until now, cooperation mostly meant trade smoothing, security cooperation, scientific collaboration, and slow movement toward friendlier relations, not reopening free movement. But today changed everything, because today the EU made its intentions extremely clear. Brussels isn't just proposing cultural exchange or limited bilateral student visas. This is a legally framed mobility agreement that looks and sounds very similar to free movement light-e, and it comes at the most politically dangerous moment possible. Just think about the political picture in Britain right now. Immigration remains the number one sensitive issue. Cultural divisions continues to shape elections. Reform UK is gaining attention with anti-immigration narratives, and Labour is trying desperately to balance economic need with the promise that Brexit decisions won't be undone. This new EU proposal hits all of those pressure points at the exact same time. Inside Westminster, the language being used right now is extraordinary. Confidential comments from advisors suggest deep concern, especially over the word uncapped. That one word instantly transforms this from a technical migration scheme into a symbolic challenge to Brexit's legacy. If there's no limit, critics will inevitably argue that the UK is letting Europe control British movement again, just without using the old phrases. And here's where things become truly explosive. The EU seems to know exactly what it's doing. This is not some random bureaucratic idea. It's a strategic move toward closer cooperation. The European Commission has been waiting for a moment like this, when Britain is economically pressured enough and politically divided enough to consider deeper alignment. So here's the real storyline unfolding right now. The European Union is testing how far it can pull Britain back into cooperation without triggering full political revolt inside the UK. It's a diplomatic chess move, and Westminster now finds itself staring at a board that is already 2 steps ahead. But let's go deeper, because this isn't just a political fight. It's economic, demographic, and very personal for millions of people. Britain currently faces worker shortages across healthcare, construction, agriculture, research, hospitality, and tech. Public services are overstretched, and population demographics are shifting fast. The EU knows that Britain needs young workers, and young Europeans, facing their own economic pressures at home, might welcome easier access to the UK. So while critics shout about borders, many industries are quietly hoping a scheme like this becomes reality. And that tension, economic needs versus political promises, is at the core of this entire crisis. If Labour accepts the deal, they risk being... And here's the twist. The EU announcement appears designed to make rejection look unreasonable. Brussels is framing this as a modern partnership, not a political reversal. They are using clever diplomatic language, mobility, not freedom of movement, young workers, not open borders, uncapped participation, not population influx. In other words, a new version of the old system, but disguised in neutral terms. And that is exactly why this has exploded inside Westminster. Politically, symbolically, and strategically, this moment is a turning point. Right now, Downing Street is scrambling, absolutely scrambling, to draft a response that won't ignite full political war. The government must appear open to cooperation, but not submissive. They must look pro-economy but not pro-EU movement. They must defend workers, protect British sovereignty and manage migration, all without sounding hostile to Europe or hostile to voters. This is, without exaggeration, one of the hardest communication challenges the Starmer government has faced since the election, and the stakes are enormous because how Britain responds today may shape UK-EU relations for the next decade. And here's the scariest question. What if this proposal is only step one? The controversy now surrounding the proposed youth mobility arrangement between the United Kingdom and the European Union is rooted in a broader debate about post-Brexit identity, population management, and the political promises made both before and after the 2016 referendum. While the idea of a youth mobility programme may appear on the surface to be a relatively modest initiative, designed to allow young citizens to travel, work, vote and study more easily, the implications go far deeper. For many Westminster observers, this proposal represents a major test of how far Britain is willing to re-engage with Europe after years of political turbulence and strained relations. But it also tests something more delicate: whether policy decisions made today are consistent with the principles that were used to justify Brexit in the first place. To understand why this particular scheme has become so politically charged, one must look at how immigration became a central factor in the Brexit campaign. Taking back control was not only about parliamentary sovereignty, trade rules or fishery rights. It was fundamentally linked to controlling who enters and remains in the United Kingdom. Therefore, any new mobility arrangement, even if limited to young people, inevitably raises questions about whether the UK is quietly walking back a core part of what Brexit was supposed to achieve. Although the government has emphasised that any youth programme would involve visas, caps and clear regulations, the European Commission has indicated a preference for an uncapped framework. That single word has reignited long-standing political sensitivities. One of the reasons the term uncapped is so politically explosive is that it is immediately associated with the open-ended nature of freedom of movement that existed before January 2021. While freedom of movement was not literally unlimited, individuals still needed jobs or financial means to sustain themselves. It was perceived as unrestricted, and that perception was central to Brexit arguments. Now, when British ministers hear the EU calling for an uncapped youth scheme, the symbolism is unavoidable. They fear that agreeing to such a scheme could be interpreted as accepting a softer re-entry into the European sphere of population mobility, only under more diplomatic language. For critics within the UK, this is not merely a technical negotiation, it is a symbolic battle about Britain's direction. At the same time, the British economy has changed significantly since Brexit, and the pressure on several workforce sectors is undeniable. The UK is currently experiencing labour shortages in hospitality, agriculture, health and social care, and certain skilled professions. Even construction and manufacturing sectors report difficulty attracting younger employees domestically. Supporters of a youth mobility scheme argue that controlled movement of young Europeans could bring economic benefits while avoiding large-scale migration. They also note that the scheme would be reciprocal, meaning British citizens would gain easier access to work and study across the continent. Universities, cultural organisations and business groups have been among the most vocal supporters of such cooperation, stating that Brexit led to a sharp decline in European student flows, research collaboration and youth exchange opportunities. Yet these economic arguments collide with powerful political forces. For Conservative MPs moreover, the British public remains deeply divided on immigration, which complicates policy making. According to recent surveys, attitudes toward immigration have become slightly more positive overall, especially among younger voters and metropolitan areas, but large segments of the country still believe immigration numbers are too high. The government's problem is that it needs migration in certain economic sectors, yet it is also politically pressured to reduce overall numbers. This tension has become increasingly evident in parliamentary debates over legal migration, student visas, and work sponsorship. Any youth mobility agreement must therefore navigate a landscape where economic needs, insights, and political promises conflict. Another emerging concern is trust. After nearly a decade of Brexit-related controversies, from parliamentary deadlock to leadership changes, public trust in political promises has weakened. If the government accepts a scheme that is later seen as a disguised return to freedom of movement, backlash could follow quickly. On the other hand, if ministers turn down a mobility proposal entirely, sectors reliant on young workers may continue to struggle, and the UK's relationship with Europe may remain strained. This puts the government in a narrow corridor of limited choices, each with substantial consequences. Finally, there is a generational dimension that cannot be ignored. Younger Britons overwhelmingly favour closer European cooperation and have been most directly affected by the end of freedom of movement. Many of them feel that Brexit removed opportunities without delivering clear benefits. A youth mobility programme could be one of the few tangible ways to restore European access for British young people without reopening full freedom of movement. This generational aspect adds yet another political layer, one that may influence future elections, especially as younger voters become a larger electoral force. From this moment forward, the central question facing both Westminster and Brussels is remarkably simple, yet politically explosive. What now? After the announcement, the immediate reaction inside the British government was described by advisers as cautious but open, suggesting that ministers are not willing to reject cooperation entirely, but they are also determined not to appear as though they are accepting a European proposal without substantial negotiation. In practical terms, the next phase will involve formal and informal diplomatic exchanges, clarification of terms, and, crucially, public political messaging designed to manage expectations on all sides. The government knows full well that a single ambiguous sentence can trigger headlines suggesting that the UK is reopening free movement. For this reason alone, every word in every official statement over the next few months will be measured with extreme precision. Yet no matter how carefully the messaging is crafted, the political terrain remains dangerously unpredictable. Reform UK and other Eurosceptic voices are likely to frame any negotiation as a threat to Brexit sovereignty, while pro-European voices will argue that the UK must engage with European economies to protect its future. This polarity is not new, but what does feel new is the extent to which Labour must strategically manage both internal divisions and external political attacks simultaneously. Within Labour's ranks, MPs who represent traditional working class constituencies remain cautious about immigration expansion, while MPs in metropolitan areas and university towns are far more favourable to European cooperation. Balancing these internal opinions will be one of the most difficult political challenges faced by the Prime Minister since forming government. Beyond Westminster, the broader diplomatic picture is even more complex. The European Union does not see youth mobility as a standalone issue. Instead, it views the initiative within a wider framework of rebuilding cooperation in science, security, climate policy, and economic partnership. In other words, from Brussels' perspective, achieving a mobility agreement is a stepping stone toward a more structured relationship that goes beyond trade. The UK, however, remains cautious about anything that appears to blur the boundaries established by Brexit, preferring sector-by-sector cooperation rather than a broad political reintegration. These different expectations, Europe wanting strategic alignment, Britain wanting selective cooperation, create an inherent tension that will shape negotiations going forward. Over the coming months, one of the most influential forces will likely be public opinion. Although British views on immigration have softened in some regions since 2016, concerns remain strong